What do satellite policy and space movies have in common? Well, for starters, space debris often plays a key role in both. In this episode of On Orbit, we talk about regulation and space movies with Henry Gola, a partner in Wiley's Telecom, Media, and Technology practice. Henry has been part of some of the biggest regulatory developments in the satellite industry, like representing the C-band alliance before the FCC. We talk about Henry's path starting out in journalism and working at ESPN to going to law school and becoming a satellite policy expert. He gives us a review of some of the top policy issues at the FCC, like the regulatory details for satellite-to-cell coverage and the FCC's single network future. This policy discussion comes with a side of space movies. Henry is a fellow podcast host, and he leads the Hosted Payload series on the Wiley Connected podcast. In Hosted Payload, he talks with industry policy experts about popular space movies. So we hear about some of his favorites, like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Gravity, and how movies have raised awareness of issues like space debris. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hi, Henry. Thank you so much for joining On Orbit today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Rachel. Excited to be on a different podcast. This is new territory for me.
Yes, a podcast crossover. You are the first podcast host that I've had on Orbit, so that's a fun milestone.
Well, that's cool, and what an honor. So it's like when Grey's Anatomy and Private Practice used to have the crossover event on ABC years ago. This is a big, big moment in podcasting history.
Moment. Yes, just like that. So, Henry, you are with Wiley Telecommunications Satellite Practice. And, I wanted to hear a little bit about you and your background and how does someone get into the very niche field of satellite telecommunications law?
Yeah, it's definitely niche. It's a lot of luck and being in the right place at the right time and kind of lucking into some exciting projects. So I was a broadcast journalism major and started my career at ESPN, where I worked in production on shows like SportsCenter and NFL Live. And then I eventually moved to ESPN.com, where I wrote NFL scouting reports and ran the site's college recruiting coverage. So the first bit of luck is where I went to law school. My fiance and now wife, Alice Ann, was applying to teaching jobs when after she was getting her PhD, and I was applying to law school. So obviously we wanted to end up in the same spot. She got a job as a postdoc at Georgetown. And so I chose George Mason in Arlington. So the first bit of luck is location, being in DC for regulatory law. Then I lucked into getting an internship with Judge Susan Braden at the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Has nothing to do with satellite law. It's government procurement. But she saw my resume as a 1L and pulled me aside. And she said, you need to go work at Wiley and do telecommunications law. I had never heard of Wiley, and I didn't know what telecommunications law entailed, as do most people when I tell them, after for a soccer party for my kids that I do telecom law. They're like, what is that?
Yeah.
So I didn't know. I didn't know either. So then I got lucky to land a summer associate job at Wiley, which I targeted after the judge sort of steered me in that direction. And they loved my TV and journalism background. And I eventually started in their telecom and media practice. But I didn't really focus on satellite law particularly.
Okay.
Until my second stint at Wiley. I'd left to go be associate general counsel at Media General, which is a broadcaster. And when I came back, it was early 2017, and there was this idea brewing for monetizing the C-band, which I knew a good project when I saw it, and I told Jen Hinden, who's the best satellite lawyer.
Was this?
This was 2017.
Okay.
So, yeah, right at the beginning.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So I talked to her and I said, I want to be a part of this. And that turned into a years-long project of, representing the C-band Alliance. And that sort of hooked me and got me involved with satellite clients and that whole world. And 6 years later, there's nothing I'd rather be doing than focusing on satellite law. So
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. CBN was also part of my intro to the satellite industry. So I joined VIA in November of 2019, and that was,
okay.
I think that same month is when the C-band order came out, or maybe it was in January of 2020. It was like
Hmm.
right around then. So that was like the very first issue that I covered over like, and really like dug into it over a couple of, I guess, weeks, months until it was adopted. But that was like the first like theme story that I followed. So
Yeah, and that's you're getting thrown right in the fire on a story
mhm.
like that, because I think in November that was right around where the whole thing
Alliance
flipped
fell
around.
apart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so can't say more than that, but that was a good
Yeah.
time for you to join. So,
Yeah. I was like, wow, this industry is much more dramatic and interesting than I thought it would be.
yeah, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, maybe Michael Lewis can write a really good tell-all book if he talks to the right people on the C-band Alliance.
Oh, I'd love to read
It'd
that.
be a good read. So
Yeah. And that's so interesting that you started out in journalism and sports journalism. I feel like law school is a common path for some people that leave journalism, but that's a really fun and interesting way that you got started out.
yeah, so I was looking at what could I do that's going to be a little more challenging than what I was doing at ESPN. I think a lot of journalists, to be fair, like I was not a news journalist. I wasn't a journalist like you. I was doing sports journalism, which is uh, not as taxing, let's say. So, so I was looking for to be a little more challenged, and I said, well, I can go be a dentist, or I
Oh.
can go to law school. And I don't like blood, and I'm really bad at spatial awareness. Like I can't do the mirror thing where you're looking at teeth. That's
Mhm.
not something I could pull off. I would be really bad at it. So I didn't need to go back to school to be to go to law school, and I knew how to write, and it turned out to be a really good fit. So it is there. You'd be surprised how many journalists go into law. It's
Mhm.
kind of a natural segue for
Yeah, very
folks.
much.
So
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and when you said that, when you mentioned that at like soccer parties, people have no idea. I always just, when people ask me what I do, I'm like, I am a journalist and I cover the satellite industry, and they're like, what the heck?
right. I know it's a major industry, right? And it's innovating and it does a bunch of cool things. And that's where I get into. It's like, so, you know, there are satellite. I'm sure you read, I start like, do you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or any newspaper? And they're like, yes. I said, do you know those cool pictures of like when the canal was blocked, or when they're showing before and after in Ukraine or before and after in some other war zone? Those are all pictures from satellites that take pictures of the Earth. They're like, oh, and I'm like, yes, and I help them out. I help them do that, right? So that's it's like you could kind of bring it down to a layman level to explain it. But like the first contact, they really they really have no idea.
Yeah,
So
yeah. But it is, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit, but it's becoming much more well known generally. And even, the New York Times, they've really upped their coverage of Starlink and Elon Musk's all of his, space, everything
yeah,
he's got going on. And so I think so yesterday I was in DC for our cybersecurity conference. And when I got back, I was in the shuttle back to my car, and the driver was asking me what I do. And I, said via satellite and satellites. And he was like, okay, so Elon Musk has some satellites. I'm like, yeah, there you go.
there
So
you go.
he
There
knew
you
about
go. Yeah, it's
Starlink.
got the celebrity factor now with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and even if you count commercial space flight, it's got Richard Branson.
Mhm.
It's got all these big personalities involved now, which I think is cool. So
Mhm.
it adds to the visibility.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about policy.
Okay.
What are the top issues that you are following at the FCC?
So I think there's I'll give you three. There's more than
Okay.
three, but I think the top three right now are supplemental coverage from space, what some of your listeners and readers might know as direct to device, and that's a nascent technology that holds a lot of promise. And go into more on that in a bit. But second is net neutrality. So the FCC just put out a notice of proposed rulemaking now that they got the fifth commissioner, Ana Gomez, confirmed. So now
Mhm.
there's a Democratic majority, and it's long, President Biden promised that they were going to bring back Title II for to regulate broadband internet access services, and satellite connectivity has come a long way since these rules were last in effect. And so there's a lot of nuance in what the NPRM means for satellite operators, and satellite operators are definitely paying attention. And the third is just spectrum proceedings generally. Spectrum is sort of the lifeblood of satellite capability. And I think a lot of satellite operators are getting a little bit more aggressive in a good way, letting policymakers know that it's vital that spectrum policy in the US keeps up with innovation and the global competitive landscape for satellite operators. They need spectrum to do what they're going to do, and it's not just wireless or other uses that the FCC needs to focus on.
Yeah,
So those
absolutely.
are the three big ones. Yeah.
Yeah, and Spectrum this is the great time to be talking about that right ahead of Work 23 coming up this month.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, work coming up. A lot of my colleagues at clients and other companies are heading overseas
Mhm.
for work. And spectrum. We mentioned before, like satellite law. What does that mean? And
Yeah.
spectrum's a big part of it. I think the best description of it, my colleague at Wiley, Meredith Singer, who does wireless law, explained it that the FCC is sort of like a local zoning authority,
Hmm.
where they are telling you what strips of land is zoned for what purpose, right? And that's sort of what spectrum is. If you think of spectrum like sort of like land use, I think
Yeah.
that can make sense for people as well. It's like this is, for everybody kind of knows in a local town, like this is commercial, this is residential, this is mixed use, and that's similar to what the FCC is doing. This is wireless, this is satellite, this is shared, right? So that's kind of the basics of what the FCC is doing there. So,
Yeah,
but
that's a great analogy.
yeah, but these, the fights over spectrum are not going to go away anytime soon, and they're brewing in different bands all the time. Every time the FCC tries to make a change, so
Yeah. So on that of satellite and cellular, and maybe a battle, maybe an opportunity to work together, this supplemental coverage from space. So in this, we're talking about telecommunications operators letting satellite use their spectrum in some situations to expand their networks, right? So models like Link or AST, and SpaceX is looking to do that with T-Mobile. Is that correct?
that's right. That's right, and that's different, from a regulatory perspective from what, say, Global Star is doing with Apple, and what Iridium has said it's going to do with Qualcomm. Um, those operators, Iridium and Global Star, they're doing that in spectrum that's authorized for mobile satellite service. So when Apple was able to sort of immediately turn on this SOS service using Global Star's network just by applying to add Apple's handsets as devices on their blanket Earth station license at the FCC. It was a relatively easy easy to do from a regulatory perspective
Mhm.
compared to supplemental coverage from space, which, terrestrial wireless operators pay billions and billions of dollars for this spectrum at auction, right?
Yes.
So, and
Yes.
it's exclusively licensed. So, rightfully so, they guard this spectrum. So, it's allocated for wireless use. And the thinking is that satellite operators will put the radios with the capabilities on their satellites to operate in certain terrestrial wireless bands, and that just like Apple is connecting with Globalstar from an iPhone, uh, 14 or 15, your handset, if you're on a network that has a deal with a satellite operator and that deal has been approved by the FCC, you'll be able to connect in remote areas to a satellite, at first likely for text messaging, and perhaps eventually for more broadband intensive uses. It's not quite there yet, but
Right.
that's where these operators are planning to go. But even having that option to be able to connect, I've driven out west from Vegas to LA, or the Grand Canyon to Sedona, and there are times where just there's no reception, and that's a
Oh
little,
yeah.
it's disconcerting. So I think, if that's that use case and others like it across the country can be solved, by this. If you get a flat tire, now you'll have a way of getting help. So
Right. I mean,
it's
it seems like a great deal for both sides. It's business for the satellite operators, and the telcos get to expand their networks without building out the physical infrastructure in those areas. So at this point, is it kind of a case by case basis that the FCC and this notice of proposed rulemaking would put more official rules in place?
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple parallel things going on right now. So there are two, like, what I would call like package applications before the FCC. There's the SpaceX T-Mobile, and there's the AT&T and AST packages. And they have the lease notification with the Wireless Bureau and the space station notification with the Space Bureau, and they seek a lot of waivers of existing rules. On a parallel track, there's the supplemental coverage from space notice of proposed rulemaking, where the FCC has said, should we have a rules and a framework for how this works? And there's back and forth between whether the FCC should sort of like stay on a case by case basis, or whether they should adopt rules. And if they do adopt rules, what form should those rules take? Just I won't. I'm going to not do what I tell my guests to do. I'm not going to say yesterday. Recently, the
Okay.
FCC's asked SpaceX some supplemental questions on their application, which is interesting. But the FCC's been a lot more active, period, in asking questions on space station applications,
Mm,
and that just came out for SpaceX on November 7th. So
okay. Today's November 8th. So yes, today
yeah,
that's yesterday, but it won't be when you're listening to this.
that's right.
So the notice of proposed rulemaking, it came out in March. Do you know when we might see like a actual report and order on this, like when it could be decided?
So I think it's a priority for the commission. I think it was maybe a bigger priority when the commission was deadlocked at 2-2,
Hmm.
um, than it might be now. I definitely think that the Title II open internet net neutrality items sort of took precedence, as sort of a administration priority. Um, but I would not be surprised. I've heard that perhaps the FCC wanted to act on the order before the individual applications, but I'm not sure that's where it's headed. I think the individual, given that those are the only two applications before the FCC, they may act on those before there's an order. But the fact that they're asking questions, and the fact that folks are interested in it, I think there could be movement in early 2024 for sure.
I think it was just about a year ago, because I remember it was at Cybersat.gov last year when the FCC announced the Space Bureau was created. And right now they are starting off a transparency initiative for satellite applicants to kind of get more information and help them apply easier. What do you think about the FCC's? Do you think this is increased engagement with the space industry? Are you seeing a change in more interest in space or more attention from the FCC to the
It,
space industry?
yeah, definitely. I think the Space Bureau was a good signal of the importance of the space industry, kind of moving forward. The transparency initiative, it's a great move by the FCC, probably bad for FCC lawyers like me, because they're making it easier for folks to understand the application. I'm kidding, but there's a lot of space and satellite startups that I've found over time they're hyper focused on the innovation and the cool products that they're going to offer, but they often lose sight of regulatory hurdles, specifically with spectrum rights at the FCC and obtaining the spectrum that they want to use for whatever application that they're going to put on their satellite.
Right.
And often that's a surprise to them that the FCC like kind of is a gating item. So I think that the fact that the FCC is putting out these sort of basic rules of the road for new satellite companies, which is basically what the Transparency Initiative is. This isn't going to help the SpaceXs and Kuipers and Intelsats of the
Right.
world. This is going to help the new guys who are like, oh, I need to go to the FCC. That should be one of my first stops. So the best news, though, for satellite lawyers, not companies, is that they've buried that the current system they have for filing, which is ICFS, and was already dated when I started as a lawyer in 2011 and has not aged well, period, is going to be replaced. So I cannot wait for
Oh,
that
I
to
didn't know
occur.
that.
Yes, I don't know if it's going to be replaced or updated, but
Yeah.
yes. If you've ever searched in there, Rachel, you
Oh my
know that
gosh. This is the bane of my existence. I would be a much better journalist if the FCC had an easier system. I mean, I've been doing this, I've been looking at filings for 4 years and I still have such a hard time navigating that system.
it's like they got an AOL CD and popped it in their computer, and that's like a website from back then. It is so dated. They know it's dated. I'm not gonna. I hope I'm not gonna catch any slack from
Ruffling
FCC
feathers.
staff members for saying that, but everyone knows it's dated. We all know it needs to be replaced, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Oh,
So
that's great. I hadn't heard that, so that's awesome. All right. So I want to switch gears and talk about your podcast. So you host a podcast for Wiley, or a series on the Wiley podcast, Hosted Payload. So can you tell us about Hosted Payload and how you got started with it?
yeah, so the last thing clients want their regulatory lawyers to do is opine on issues that they're representing them on in front of the FCC. So doing a podcast series or coming up with an idea is kind of hard, because you can't have an opinion on the thing you do for a living, right? It's either got to be facts, which sometimes can be, kind of boring, or it has to be an opinion on something else. So the idea I came up with was that we would do two parts. There's about a 5-minute segment where I'm joined by one of my junior colleagues like Chloe Hawker or Jillian Quigley, and they give like a quick news update on 3 items in the space and satellite industry, and it's all facts. There's no opinion. It's like FCC released a notice, the FAA released a notice, the James Webb Telescope saw a new galaxy, they saw a supermassive black hole that could have started the universe yesterday, whatever it may be. So that's 5 minutes. And then I'll have a guest from the satellite industry, and we just get right into it and talk about a movie that we've both either watched for the first time or more commonly rewatched. And we talk about it for about 15 or 20 minutes. And luckily, my clients don't care about my opinion on Starship Troopers, because it gives me license to talk about movies. So that's where it came from. It was sort of like it kind of came organically, but it
Yeah.
allows me to, yeah, go ahead.
That's a fun way of getting around your limitations of what you can talk about. But it's also fun to kind of have the buttoned up policy lawyers talking about space movies. So
Yeah.
I listened to the Starship Troopers one before this, and I have not seen that movie. And honestly, from your description of it, I don't think I will.
Yeah, I don't think you're missing anything. I hadn't seen it since college. I watched a ton in college. It was one of those movies that was just on TV all the time in college. And, that was before streaming services. So whatever was on like TBS or TNT often was just like on in the house we were in. So, and that just happened to be one of them. But yeah, it was different watching it now than then, for sure. So.
Yeah. So what have been some of your favorite space movies that you've talked about on the podcast?
So I guess similarly to Starship Troopers, I hadn't watched 2001: A Space Odyssey since I was in college, and rewatching it as a 44-year-old is a lot different than watching it as a 20-year-old. So, first, my takes now are, first, it's an hour too long. It's a very long movie. Second, the acting is absolutely atrocious. Would not pass muster today. Like there's no way they would let these actors, be cast in these roles. But the movie is so groundbreaking and so prescient about technology and artificial intelligence and just space in general that it's not hard to marvel at at what the movie accomplished. It's held up remarkably well for a movie made in the late 60s.
Yeah.
In those respects, so that was cool to watch. On the flip side, it's like I said, we're rewatching a lot of these movies. I hadn't
Yeah.
seen Armageddon since I was in high school,
Oh, okay.
and I'm not sure I liked the movie then, and I definitely don't like it now. Like that has not aged well at all.
I have a funny story about Armageddon. I have not seen Armageddon, but I knew some of the premise. And then a couple years ago, I was watching October Sky with my husband, and I got mixed up and thought that it was going to be the plot of Armageddon because he's in a coal mine. And I was like, I know that there was a guy who was like oil rigging and he went to space. And I was like, this movie seems like, kind of like friendly and personable. I don't really see the government coming in and like, it seems really realistic. When is he going to have to go to space and do drilling?
When is the ragtag bunch of oil men? When are they going to space? Yeah, right.
And he was like, what the hell? That's Armageddon. This is
Yeah. Well, you should have been clued in when there was no Aerosmith song about a half hour in. You knew it was Armageddon.
Completely different types of space movies, those two.
That's funny.
And I should be embarrassed to admit this on the On Orbit podcast, but I have not seen 2001 Space Odyssey. So I think I just need to not bite the bullet, but I need to just check that off my list.
You should check it off, and you'll realize how many movies and commercials and everything else, either parody or copy or mime, aspects of 2001. Even the Barbie movie. Did you see the Barbie movie this summer?
Yes.
All right. So the beginning of the Barbie movie is the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey. So like that's kind of cool.
That's awesome.
So yeah, definitely recommend it. It's like I said, there's some flaws, but it's overall,
it's like the hallmark of the genre. So it's like
exactly.
Yeah. I saw on the list that that Gravity was one that you talked about.
Yes.
I watched that one. I love that movie.
Yeah. So Gravity, the first two we did were The Martian and Gravity, and they sort of both share the theme of loneliness and being alone in the vastness of space. Matt Damon is on Mars alone, and Sandra Bullock is alone in space. Not that I hope I'm not giving anything away for those who've watched past 20 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
But yeah. So it's they both use space as sort of a vehicle to tell a larger story about the human experience. And watching Gravity for the first time, actually. So I hadn't seen Gravity. Gravity came out when my twin girls were very young. So that's like a black hole in my movie watching experience. So I saw it for the first time when I did the podcast, and I thought the whole thing was sort of like a metaphor for Sandra Bullock getting over the loss of her daughter, and sort of going through like the stages of grief, which I thought was really cool. And plus it was about space, and just the, separately, like the shots, the cinematography was just awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, they could put that movie in a planetarium at the Air and Space Museum and it would be great. So
yeah, that would be awesome. I mean, I had to Google after watching it, like what was scientifically accurate. And, a lot of it was, but not a lot of, some things, yes, and some things, no. But just to like see the challenges of the harsh environment and like movement, and you can't stop things that are moving, and Um,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Orbital debris, space junk is traveling faster than you can imagine, right?
Mhm.
when it's orbiting the Earth. And so to go back to an earlier theme about explaining like what space lawyers do, what satellite lawyers do. Orbital debris is a huge issue. And they're like, what's that? Oh, have you seen Gravity? Yeah, I've seen Gravity. Well, do you
Yes.
know what happens there? Yeah, that like how there's debris in space and it becomes a whole plot point. They're like, oh yeah, okay, I get that. Um, Orbital debris is in a lot of movies. I
Hmm.
realized it's in Gravity, Wall-E,
Hmm.
animated movie from Disney. They fly up through space through orbital debris. Don't Look Up, which we haven't done yet, but I've
Okay.
just watched independently last year, has a whole, sort of it's meant for laughs, but it's got just a bunch of like things flying in space, orbiting the Earth when the sort of billionaire character is escaping with Meryl Streep in the spaceship to get off of Earth. Um, so it's more common than I realized for sure.
Yeah, I
So
was going to ask if you thought that gravity raised awareness of orbital debris, but I mean, it probably did because that movie was so big, but it
yeah.
sounds like orbital debris is already kind of a plot device or a factor in lots of space movies.
It is. It is. I was watching 3 years ago. I was watching a Cat in the Hat Dr. Seuss thing on Amazon Prime. It's one of these like long form Cat in the Hat things, and it was the Cat in the Hat in space, and they were like dodging space junk. It was like it was in a
Oh,
cartoon. So it's crazy. So yeah, I mean Hollywood's aware. And the satellite industry is definitely aware. I think folks are taking it seriously, and I mean that's definitely it's if you're talking about hot button issues and
mhm.
issues that are sort of transcend the space and satellite industry. Orbital debris is one. It's one people can understand. It has an easy analog with climate change and sort of
Right.
sustainability and responsibility and sort of this global good. So yeah, that's a huge issue as we for the next 10 to 20 years and beyond. So
Yeah. Yeah. One other thing about Gravity I was thinking about was, and this is a spoiler if anyone hasn't seen Gravity, but when she does make it back to Earth against all odds, and she pops open the hatch and then the water starts rushing in, and it's like, oh my gosh, she's not going to be able to fight
yeah,
against the water coming in and she has to swim out. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, she's going to make it. It's fine. She can just, swim out once the whole thing is submerged, but she's wearing the spacesuit and it's like, all of these environments are so harsh. Like even, when we're out in people, if someone's out in the wilderness, that is not a harshest environment of space, but it's like nature is trying to kill us in every way almost. And
yeah,
you don't see what happens after. And obviously it's a heroic ending that she makes it back to Earth. But I'm like, well, where is she? Like, are people gonna be able to find her? Like she hasn't
right.
had water in a long time.
Yeah, that'll be in Gravity too. Yeah, no,
Mhm.
but but no, you're absolutely right, and that's why there was the Commercial Space Federation conference last year, and there were some folks from the government talking about colonizing the moon and eventually
Yeah.
colonizing Mars, and how the time frame for that is not soon, right? Like there's so much that needs to be studied and looked at because these environments are so harsh. You're not going to an island where you could just it's not Animal Crossing where you
No.
could just set up a house and and the store comes
Yeah.
and there's water and food. It's going to be difficult, but it speaks to human ingenuity that we're going for it and we're going to make
Yeah.
an effort to do it. So
Yeah, sustaining life will be a much bigger engineering challenge than even just getting there, which is hard enough. So,
yeah, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So
So, what movie is next on your list?
well, guests get to pick the movie. I send them
Oh,
a
okay.
list of like what's on the streaming services, but I'd love to do Interstellar as
Mm,
it soon. Watching that movie is like cracking a code, I feel like, and I'd love to hear other people's perspective on it, and likely my perspective on it will be different than the first time I saw it, and I'll likely learn something as well, because anybody who tells you they know exactly what's happening in that movie is probably lying. So,
Yeah.
right? Or has read a lot of stuff on the internet to get their theories. So.
Cool. We'll stay tuned for that episode. And who would be your dream podcast guest?
It's a good question. There's some obvious answers from folks we mentioned earlier in the episode, but I think Mark Kelly, the former astronaut and now senator from Arizona,
Yeah.
I'd love getting his perspective on whether a certain space movie gets things right, as you were alluding to earlier with Gravity.
Yeah, he would be great for that.
And I'm sure he'd love taking a break from politics to talk about a movie as well. So I think he'd be great. So.
Oh, I love that idea. Well, maybe petition to get Mark Kelly on hosted Payload.
I will. I'll start bugging his office now. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Henry, thank you so much. It's been awesome talking with you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I had a blast.
All right. Well, I will continue listening to Hosted Payload to see what space movies I need to add to my list, because
exactly. And I'll have to return the favor. You're going to have to watch a space movie if I have you on. So.
Okay, I would love it.
All right. Thanks, Rachel.
Okay, see ya.
See ya.